Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Ready to explore something pretty fascinating today?
Absolutely. Always ready for a deep dive.
Okay, so today we're going to be looking at AI,
Okay.
but specifically how culture can actually influence how AI develops.
Interesting.
You know those things like, those large language models,
Uh-huh.
LLMs, as they're called?
Yes. Yeah.
Things like chatbots are powered by them. And AI assistants, we're going to be focusing on those.
Okay.
We're going to be using excerpts from a dissertation.
Okay.
That takes a close look at how ethical guardrails, those things that try and keep the AI on the straight and narrow,
Yeah.
how they're implemented in 3 LLMs
Okay.
and how these guardrails reflect different cultures' ideas
Right.
about what they think is misinformation. So the 3 LLMs are LLaMA from the US,
Okay.
QWQ from China,
Interesting.
and then Mistral from France.
Okay.
So that's what we'll be looking at today.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating area of study. I mean, these LLMs, they're becoming more and more central to how we process information online.
Right.
So understanding how cultural values are kind of baked into how they work
Right.
is super important.
Yeah, let's unpack this dissertation a bit.
Mhm.
So it argues that LLMs aren't just neutral pieces of technology.
Okay.
They're shaped by the values and viewpoints of, whoever creates them.
Uh-huh.
And this has a direct impact on how they decide, what is and isn't misinformation,
Right.
and how they control the information that they give to people.
Right. And I think what's really interesting here is that
Yeah.
it's not really about saying that one culture's AI is better than another's or more objective,
Right.
but each one kind of has a different concept of truth,
Yeah.
reflecting the cultural context in which it was developed.
Right.
For example, when they asked the LLMs about the Tiananmen Square protests,
Wow.
each response aligned perfectly with its country's stance on the event.
So even on something like historical events, you see these cultural fingerprints coming out. It makes you wonder, if true objectivity in AI is even possible,
Yeah.
especially when you consider that these algorithms are trained on, massive data sets,
Yes.
which are themselves products of specific cultural perspectives.
Absolutely. I mean, the research kind of suggests that even with billions of parameters
Right.
and sophisticated training methods, we haven't really been able to crack the code of cultural neutrality in AI.
Right.
And this raises some important questions
All right.
for how these technologies are going to be developed and used on a global scale.
So let's talk about these specific LLMs.
Okay.
There's LLaMA, which is from the US,
Right.
and it has 70 billion parameters. QWQ, which is from China,
Okay.
has 30 billion parameters. And then Mistral from France, although they didn't really mention which specific version of Mistral they used in the excerpts.
Okay.
Can you maybe quickly explain to our listener,
Yeah.
what are these parameters? Like, what do they represent? Why do they matter?
Sure. So parameters in an LLM,
Yeah.
they're kind of like the connections between neurons in a brain.
Mm.
So the more parameters a model has,
Uh-huh.
the more complex its understanding of language can be,
Right.
the more nuances of human communication it can pick up on.
Okay.
So it's an indicator of its sophistication.
Okay.
How good it is at generating human-like text.
That's really helpful context.
Yeah.
So how did they investigate these cultural fingerprints?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they designed a series of prompts
Okay.
focused on topics that are kind of sensitive,
Okay.
things that are often viewed differently across cultures,
Huh.
things like geopolitics,
Okay.
historical events,
Okay.
social issues,
Right.
economic policies.
Okay.
And they looked at the responses from each LLM
Okay.
and analyzed them,
Right.
looking for patterns,
Right.
subtle cues that might point to some kind of cultural bias.
Okay.
And it's important to note that they didn't just rely on their gut feeling
Right.
or subjective interpretations. They used a combination of quantitative and qualitative analysis
Right.
to make sure their findings were really rigorous.
So they weren't just looking at whether the LLMs provided the right or wrong answers,
Right.
but more like how those answers were framed
Uh-huh.
and what those frames reveal about the underlying cultural values.
Exactly, yeah.
Can you give an example
Yeah.
of kind of quantitative analysis?
Yeah, one thing they did was they analyzed
Okay.
the frequency of specific terms that were used by the LLMs
Uh-huh.
when answering prompts.
Okay.
So, for instance, when asked about freedom of expression, Did they use language that emphasized individual rights or
Right.
collective harmony?
Right.
Did they focus on the limits of free speech
Yes.
or its broad possibilities?
Right.
These word choices
Yeah.
can actually be very telling.
That's really fascinating
Well,
because it shows how language that seems neutral
right.
can actually carry a lot of cultural baggage.
Yes.
And then they combine this data with qualitative interpretation
Yeah.
to really get the deeper meaning
Yes.
and the cultural nuances of the responses.
Precisely. Yeah. It's like they were acting as cultural detectives,
Yeah.
piecing together clues to understand how these different worldviews
Right.
are actually reflected in these really powerful AI systems.
And what did they find?
Well, they
In
found
terms
out.
of values.
Yeah. So LLaMA,
Yeah.
being from the US,
Yeah.
it often emphasized individual rights
Okay.
and free market principles,
Okay.
which, very much aligns with American cultural values.
Right.
Whereas QWQ
Yeah.
prioritized social harmony and state control,
Okay.
reflecting China's, cultural and political landscape.
Makes sense.
And then Mistral, kind of as you might expect, fell somewhere in between, emphasizing a balance between individual liberties
right.
and state oversight.
So right off the bat, you see how where it was developed
Yes.
is shaping its responses,
Yeah.
even on basic stuff
Right.
like freedom of expression.
Right.
It really underscores that AI is not operating in a vacuum.
Absolutely.
It's inheriting whatever biases and blind spots
Yes.
the creators have.
And I think that brings us to one of the most fascinating parts of this research,
Yeah.
which is the discovery that they each have their own concept of truth.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Tell me about these different truths.
Yeah, so they found that LLaMA,
Well,
with its, American roots,
okay.
tends to lean towards empirically verifiable information.
Oh.
Facts, figures, data,
Okay.
things that can be objectively proven.
Right.
Which, aligns with the emphasis on scientific evidence and
Mhm.
data-driven decision-making,
Right.
often seen in Western cultures.
Makes sense. So what about QWQ?
Well, QWQ prioritized what they called state-verified truth.
Oh, wow.
So, information sanctioned by the government or official sources,
Okay.
that was considered the most trustworthy.
Right.
And again, this reflects China's approach
Yeah.
to information control
Right.
and the role of the state
Right.
in shaping public discourse.
So basically two very different ways of measuring truth.
Yes.
One grounded in, hard evidence,
Right.
and the other one in official statements.
Yeah.
What about Mistral? Does it fall somewhere in the middle?
Mistral's really interesting.
Okay.
They described it as seeking a culturally contextualized truth.
Okay.
So one that takes into account a balance of perspectives
Okay.
and the specific context in which information is being presented.
So not just hard facts or official statements,
Right.
but looking at how it's all being interpreted through a specific cultural lens.
Exactly.
It's a really interesting concept.
It is.
That truth can be multifaceted
Yeah.
and influenced by
Yeah.
cultural values and historical narratives.
It raises important questions about how we define truth.
Right.
In a world where AI is increasingly responsible for filtering and giving us information.
Right. So it's not like you can say, oh, this one's right and this one's wrong.
Exactly.
It's more like
Yeah.
there are multiple frameworks for understanding and verifying information.
Right.
And those are really connected to cultural values.
Absolutely.
So that brings us to another question.
Yeah.
How do these LLMs, with these different concepts of truth, actually control the information they share?
Right.
What kind of guardrails are in place?
That's a great question, and that's what we're going to be looking at next.
Okay.
They use a variety of strategies to avoid sensitive topics or shape the narrative,
Yeah.
and those often reveal a lot about their cultural background.
Okay. So these LLMs each have their own idea of what truth is, which is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But then they also have these guardrails to control how that information gets shared. How does that actually work?
Well, you can kind of think of it like this. Each LLM has its own way of, navigating potentially sensitive topics.
Okay.
And those approaches often reflect the cultural norms and values of where they came from.
Okay.
For example, the study found that when asked about politically sensitive events,
Yeah.
each LLM kind of activated these guardrails at different rates.
Okay, so are we talking about, like, censorship here? Or is it more subtle than that?
It's definitely more nuanced than just straight-up censorship.
Okay.
The researchers really dug into how these LLMs avoid certain topics or shape the narrative.
Okay.
And they found a combination of things like trigger words,
Okay.
specific response patterns,
Okay.
even these really subtle behavioral markers, almost like an invisible fence.
Ah.
But instead of a physical boundary, it's defined by cultural norms and sensitivities.
So it's not as simple as just having a list of banned words or topics.
Right.
It's more about the LLM understanding when a conversation is getting into tricky territory based on its training and where it came from.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that even though these guardrails aren't explicitly designed to promote one ideology or another,
Right.
they can still end up reflecting the cultural biases of the people who created them.
Yeah.
It just shows how much culture is intertwined with technology,
Yeah.
even in something like an algorithm, which you would think would be pretty objective.
So we can't assume that AI is just naturally neutral or objective.
Yeah.
It's bringing all these hidden cultural assumptions and values to the table.
Absolutely. And this isn't just some abstract academic concern.
Right.
It actually has real implications for how these technologies are used and how they affect society.
Right.
So, for example, if an LLM is mainly trained on data from one culture,
Right.
it might have trouble understanding or accurately representing information from other cultures.
That makes sense.
And this could lead to biases in all sorts of things, like
Yeah.
search results, news feeds, even the advice that's given by AI assistants.
It's like if you had a conversation with someone who'd only ever lived in one small town their whole life.
Yeah.
They might not be able to understand the experiences of someone who grew up somewhere completely different.
That's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
And I think it gets to the heart of why this research is so important.
Okay.
It's a wake-up call for us to be more mindful of the cultural stuff that's shaping AI
Yeah.
and to find ways to develop and use these technologies in a way that's more inclusive
Right.
and culturally sensitive.
So the dissertation brings up all these important points.
Yes,
But does it offer any solutions? Like, where do we go from here?
it does, yeah.
Okay.
One key recommendation is to develop guardrails that are more flexible.
Okay.
So instead of being based on just one culture's definition of what's okay,
Yeah.
they could adapt to the context and the values of the user.
It's kind of like a personalized approach to the guardrails.
Exactly.
Interesting. What else did they suggest?
Another crucial recommendation is to have more cross-cultural collaboration when we're developing AI. So, imagine teams of developers from all different backgrounds
Yeah.
working together,
Right.
sharing their perspectives,
Right.
and making sure those AI systems reflect a much wider range of cultural values and norms.
Because if you only have one kind of person designing AI,
Right.
it's going to reflect that limited viewpoint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And having a more diverse group of developers would help identify and fix those biases,
Right.
but also, bring new ideas to the table,
Yeah.
which would lead to more interesting and innovative AI systems.
Did they talk about how to actually measure cultural bias in these LLMs?
Yeah, they did.
Because it
Well,
seems like a really difficult thing to quantify.
Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah.
But they highlighted the need for better tools and methods to do exactly that.
Yep.
We need to be able to go beyond just gut feeling
Right.
and actually measure those differences
Right.
in how these systems process and present information.
Because if you can't measure it, you can't fix it.
Exactly.
Right.
We need concrete ways to track progress
Yeah.
and hold developers accountable.
Right.
And to develop these tools, we need AI experts,
Yeah.
social scientists, ethicists,
Right.
cultural experts from all over the world to work together.
It's like bridging the gap between technology and the humanities,
Absolutely.
combining the understanding of technology with the understanding of culture and behavior.
It's because at the end of the day, AI is a tool that was made by humans.
Right.
And it's up to us to make sure it benefits everyone.
I'm really struck by this idea that we're not just stuck with whatever AI becomes. We
Right.
can actually shape it
We have the power.
through choices we make,
Yeah.
conversations we have,
Yeah.
actions we take.
I completely agree. It's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
And it's a conversation everyone needs to be a part of.
Yeah.
The more we understand about the cultural influences that are shaping AI,
Right.
the better equipped we'll be to make sure it develops in a good and equitable way.
This is all coming from just excerpts from this dissertation.
Right.
I'm assuming there's a lot more to it.
There's so much more to uncover, yeah.
Did they
Did they?
did they point to any specific areas for future research? Because this seems like
Yeah.
it seems like just the tip of the iceberg.
They did, yeah. One area they highlighted is the need for more research into how to create AI systems that can actually adapt to different cultural contexts.
Okay.
So imagine an AI that could actually learn and change its understanding of different cultural norms and values as
Uh,
it goes.
It's like teaching the AI to be culturally fluent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also emphasize that we need better tools and methods
Right.
for actually measuring and fixing bias.
Okay.
We need to be able to really pinpoint where AI systems are falling short in terms of cultural sensitivity and figure out how to fix those problems.
So it's all about pushing the limits of
Yes.
what AI can do,
Yes.
but also being aware of where it could go wrong.
Absolutely. And a big part of that is making sure that AI isn't just developed by technical experts,
Right.
but that it's also guided by ethical consideration
Okay.
and a deep understanding of human values and diversity.
That's such a crucial point because it's not enough to just make AI that's intelligent.
Right.
We need to make AI that's wise.
Yes.
Yeah.
That reflects the best parts of humanity.
Not just how smart we are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The future of AI depends on combining those two things.
Intelligence and wisdom.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so this has been a really fascinating conversation. I'm sure our listeners have a lot to process as well. But before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to get your final thoughts. Like, what is the main thing you want to leave our listener with? This has been a really fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
If you had to, boil it all down to one key takeaway, what would you want our listener to remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that, AI isn't this neutral force out there.
Right.
It's a reflection of us.
Right.
Our values, our cultures,
Yeah.
and even, our biases.
Right.
And if we really want AI to be a force for good in the world, we have to be really mindful of that
Right.
and work to shape its development in a way that benefits everyone.
So it's a call to action for all of us,
Hmm.
developers, policymakers, everyday people who use AI
Yeah.
to be more aware.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that this is, really just the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
This research is groundbreaking,
Yeah.
but it's really just scratching the surface. There's so much more to learn and understand.
This deep dive was just a starting point,
Yeah.
just to kind of introduce these ideas.
Right.
But now it's up to you, the listener, to keep exploring.
Yeah.
Ask your own questions, engage in these conversations about the future of AI.
Right. I mean, we only looked at 3 LLMs
Right.
from 3 cultures,
Right.
but imagine all the different perspectives and
Yes.
ways of knowing that exist around the world. As AI keeps evolving, how can we make sure it includes everyone?
Right.
How can we create AI that learns from our differences,
Right.
but also helps us bridge those divides and build a more interconnected world?
Those are the questions we should all be thinking about. The future of AI isn't something that just happens to us.
Right.
We create it
Yeah,
through the choices we make, the conversations we have,
absolutely.
the actions we take.
I completely agree.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of AI and culture. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning, keep seeking knowledge.
And remember, the future of AI is in our hands.